Hey. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Nina.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, doing well. We're
And
just over here at the theater.
I know I can see that beautiful backdrop.
It's thrown together.
And I'm home, and I noticed that I still have theater pallor, as do you.
Oh, yeah.
But what a wonderful night to be together, and I'm excited to welcome our friend Sue Mellen, who I knew probably 42 or 43 years ago, as an actor at the theater. But she's a writer and a novelist, and we're so thrilled to have her with us tonight to talk about the history of theater on Cape Cod, which our theater, going into its 70th season, after the season that really wasn't for our 69th season, in 2021. And we have such a long history, but there's so many wonderful theaters on Cape Cod, and we're so lucky to be part of it all, and lucky to have Sue here with us tonight. But before we bring her on, I just want to say hello to everyone who happens to be watching, and to say hope that we all stay healthy, and we send our best wishes. And our theater has so many plans to keep going, no matter what, whether we're virtual or with our limited live classes or our virtual programming. And hopefully next spring and summer we'll have an outdoor space, but perhaps everybody will be vaccinated by then, and we can also be back inside. But we have lots of plans to keep going, don't we, Matt?
Lots and lots of plans, and I'm looking forward to making those plans and goals a reality over the next 6, 9, 12 months.
I know it's hard to tell how time going by right now. But anyway, thanks everybody for sticking with us and for supporting theater on Cape Cod in whatever medium we happen to find ourselves. Just a little bit of an announcement. Next week we have Michael Paul Brennan, who's returned to us from Nashville after having been in the TV series Nashville for 6 seasons. But he performed on Cape Cod for years, and he was in many, many musicals. He's a great singer and songwriter, and we'll have him with us next week. And in December, we're planning to have Murray Doherty with Richard Sullivan perform on our stage, that Matt will be filming and will be bringing to you online. And beyond that, there's some other surprises coming up. Plus, Tammy is working hard on planning our winter session of classes, both virtual and some socially distant classes in the theater. So right now, I just want to say thank you and bring on our friend Sue Mellen.
Hi, Nina.
Hi, Sue.
Hi, Matt. Oh, Nina, it's always so good to see you. And
It's
that was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Well, I have to say that when I saw you in the lobby of our theater, what was it, 2 years ago? For the
2 or 3 years ago, right? When
I was just so happy and so moved because, I've thought about you so often over the years and tried to keep up with where you were and what was going on. And, to be a writer, I find it so fascinating. And so I have questions for you. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer. Like, when did you first realize you wanted to become a writer? Because I knew you as a singer and an actress and a dancer.
Well, I was also writing then, too, at the same time. And I actually knew I wanted to be a writer when I first sat on my father's knee and played with the typewriter. He was an editor of our town newspaper. and he used to let me play with his old Smith Corona. And I was probably 3 or 4. And from that time on, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. So it was always there in the background, even when I was doing other things. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So as I introduce the video that we're going to be showing in a few minutes.
But what brought you into the world of theater?
Well, I think it started as a social thing for me. I started at the Chatham Drama Guild, and that was a very social organization with a lot of families and longtime families who've been there many generations. And then from there, I became interested in the theater. So that was about 40 years ago.
Right.
And so I'll talk about a little bit how this all evolved. Shall I tell you about that now?
Yeah, please do. I can't wait to hear.
Okay, good. So
out there too. It seems so like I keep forgetting that actually other people might be watching. I feel like I'm just talking to you in that way.
Chat a little. That's fine. But yeah, when I first stepped on the stages of a number of theater companies, including, of course, the Harwich Junior Theater, where if you remember, I was a jester for at least one season, or maybe 2. I'm not sure. Can you picture me in that little jester outfit now?
We still have one that would fit you. So if you want to reprise that role,
absolutely. And then, as I said, there was the Chatham Drama Guild, and then Monomoy Theater, and then the Cape Cod Community College Players.
Right.
And I just felt from the very beginning that it was magical being on stage and transformative. And you leave your old life behind, and suddenly you're a different person, a different character, and all the problems are gone, except remembering your lines, of course. But but because I am a writer at heart, I wanted to write about that. So I began doing theater reviews for Cape Cod Times, as well as articles about theater and theater personalities. And I did that, if you remember, for about a blissful 10 years.
Yes.
And then experienced some life changes. And so I went away to college and got married and had children and moved various places, including Florida. But eventually found my way back to the Cape, because I believe that that's what everybody does. And it doesn't matter if you're gone, 2 weeks or 2 decades, or in my case, 4 decades. But there's something magical about the Cape that just draws you back. And I think draws people here for the first time. So really, that's what was happening at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when artists and playwrights and actors and writers of every kind were finding their way to 2 artist colonies on the Cape. One in Provincetown, of course. So everything begins at Land's End, right?
Right.
And then one on Nantucket, which actually began in 1890.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, 1890 in Seaconset, as a matter of fact. And I'll go into that in the video. But so actors and performers and playwrights and artists moved outward from those colonies onto the Cape and beyond. But that's sort of getting ahead of things. I go into all of that in the video. But then my history. So I came back and I saw what had happened. I was lucky enough to begin doing reviews again. And I saw that the theater culture had just thrived since I had been.
It really blossomed. I mean, since I knew you in the 70s, I mean, the number of theaters that have propped up and have thrived. And, you know, what's so wonderful about our particular theater is that, you know, we see the kids grow up through high school, you know, junior high, high school, and I guess it's middle school now. high school and then go off to college, and they come back, and they're in other theaters, but they still come back to our theater. And also, one of the nicest things a few of the local artistic directors have said to me is that they can always tell somebody who grew up at Harwich Junior Theater.
Right. I've heard that. I've heard that in all of my research again and again. You hear that from people.
So as an educational theater, I feel like we're an incubator for theater on Cape Cod, both, in terms of performance and technical theater. Matt trains a lot of technicians, and they go off and work in other places. It's really, it's phenomenal. But
in fact, I say that in my book. If you talk to a longtime theater person in the Cape and ask them where they began, they always say at Harwich.
Yeah, so it makes me feel really good, to hear that. So can we go to your video?
Sure. I did want to say a couple of things here. Okay, just wanted to say that when I realized how the theater culture had thrived and I began doing reviews again, I wanted to write about that. And I wanted to write something comprehensive. That's why I decided to do the book. And actually, the last time anybody did a history of theater on Cape Cod was Evelyn Lawson, who was a noted reviewer back in the 50s and 60s. And she wrote the little book, History of Theater on Cape Cod. And I'm very indebted to her, used her book for a lot of research. So what I did was create what I hope is a sweeping panorama of the history of theater on the Cape. And I hope it will convince people that they can come to the Cape to lie and bask in our sun, but they can also bask in the glow of theater on Cape Cod.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Well, thank you for taking that on. I know it must have been a huge project.
It was wonderful, actually. It was a year of absolute joy when I was writing it, every minute, just every second. Sometimes I would get to my computer at 7 a.m. and then realize it was getting dark and it was 8 or 9 at night.
Wow. And when you talk about Evelyn Lawson, I mean, there was a whole period of time where we had the Evie Awards on the
That's right. I talk about that in the book. Yeah.
Yep. And I actually won an Evie for the only show I ever costumed, really, legitimately, which was, I think, for Equus, for Maura Hanlon and Art Divine. Or Maura was in it. I think Maura directed it too. I'm trying to remember now. But that was a nice period of time back then when we gave those Evie Awards. I don't know whatever happened to them, but maybe we need to renew them. But it's so nice to talk about theater, and now is a good time to really appreciate it and value live theater because we all want a renaissance.
Absolutely. And I think there will be. Okay. This is all over, too. I think there's going to be a huge artistic renaissance.
Thanks. So are we going to the video?
Sure.
Let's do it.
Here we go. I can't wait to see it. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, great. Good. Okay.
It's a summer's eve on Cape Cod, and everywhere there are the sounds of waves lapping against the shore, gulls crying out, and children laughing and chattering as they play an endless game of tag with the waves. But there are also other sounds. There's the soaring sound of an orchestra tuning up, and the sound of laughter at perfectly played physical comedy, and then dramatic lines hitting the air like a knife blade. Those are the sounds of summer theater on Cape Cod. Every summer and increasingly into the fall season, people come from all over the world to see New York quality theater on Cape Cod without the hustle and bustle and heat and grit and grime of the city. They're treated to world-class theater. In fact, according to the Cape Cod Theater Coalition, 600,000 people actually view performances in a normal summer on Cape Cod. Now, unfortunately, this past summer has not been what we would call an average summer on the Cape. Unfortunately, the theaters have been darkened, but theaters have continued through the pandemic to produce virtual productions and performances and acting classes all through the summer and have continued so into the fall. So what is it about theater on Cape Cod that makes it world quality? And one of the things is fierce competition. There are actually more than 36 theater companies, and that number is continuing to increase every year. So 36 theater companies across the small spit of land and the islands on Cape Cod. But there's something more. There's a long-standing tradition of theater on the Cape that goes back more than 100 years. In fact, it all began in what was once a sleepy little fishing village called Provincetown, which became a mecca for artists and writers and playwrights and performers, and to this day is still a mecca for artists of every description. And that theater tradition traveled across the Cape, up and down and into the islands. So let's look at where it all began, and that's at the Land's End. Or for our purposes, we might say the land's beginning. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there was really a revolution in all of the arts and all around the world. There were writers like Henry David Thoreau and Henry James, and then visual artists like Monet and Manet, and of course Pablo Picasso in Europe, who were breaking new ground. And what they wanted to do was to break free of the strictures of European style theater and the arts and literature and create something that was uniquely modern. And in Provincetown, there was an artist, Charles Webster Hawthorne, who in fact had a school for artists, and he was teaching a technique called en plein air. Now, as the name sort of tells you, it was exactly what it says. It was teaching artists to create the natural world, to translate the natural world in a natural way to canvas. And that was attracting, beginning with visual artists, was bringing in visual artists from places like Boston and New York, where they would hop on a train and then eventually wend their way to the forming artist colony in Provincetown. And in fact, by 1916, the Boston Globe had printed a headline that said, "World's greatest and biggest artist colony in Provincetown." And playwrights were making their way to this colony as well. One of them was Susan Glaspell, who was a well-known playwright in her time. And she was actually convincing other artists and performers and playwrights to make their way to the art colony in Provincetown. And one of those was Eugene O'Neill. And he was a fledgling playwright at the time. And if you know anything about theater history, then that's a name that should jump out on you, because without exaggeration, Eugene O'Neill was responsible for transforming American drama into a truly American art form. In fact, in a little play called Bound East for Cardiff, which was produced on, for the first time, was staged in a little rickety fishing house that was transformed into a little theater in a wharf in P-Town. And that was on July 28th in 1916. And that was really the beginning. That and other works of his that followed were the very beginning of American drama as we know it today. He created characters that were uniquely American. In fact, his lead character in Bound East was Yank, and dealt with subjects that were uniquely American, like class issues that weren't being dealt with in other places at that time. So through that summer of 1916, the little vanguard of playwrights continued to produce works, avant-garde works of their own, and to perform in one another's plays and direct one another's plays. So it became this thriving art community, artist community in Provincetown. Then by the fall, they decided to take their success and go to Gotham with it. So they went to New York, which they thought was going to be just one season. And actually, it turned out to be 7 seasons that they were in New York. And they inhabited a theater that was originally called the Playwrights Theater, and then became known as the Provincetown Playhouse, obviously as a nod to their beginnings in Provincetown. So during that time, however, they were going back and forth between New York and Provincetown, and continue to act in productions on the wharf. Unfortunately, though, in 1917, the Little Wharf Theater burned down, and by 1922 had been swept away by a fierce storm into the sea. But that didn't mean that theater was done in Provincetown. In fact, the activity moved to the west side of P-Town, to a barn of all places for a theater. Frank Shea, who was a bookseller and a fledgling playwright in his own right, actually opened his barn on the west side of Provincetown, and his troupe of players became known as the Barnstormers. And in fact, the Provincetown players also acted with Frank in the barn. And over time, a couple of factions actually formed of the Barnstormers. There was one that was dedicated to the avant-garde works of people like O'Neill and Glaspell and the St. Vincent Millay. But at the same time, there was another faction that was sort of stuck in tradition. And this was kind of led by an actress named Mary Bicknell, who eventually formed her own group of players called the Wharf Players. And they took residence in a little wharf theater again, which was sort of the second iteration of the wharf theaters in Provincetown. So this was at 83 Commercial Street, but there's a little piece of theater trivia that's sort of interesting here. There was no love lost between these two factions. And in fact, theater trivia tells us that the new wharf players left absconded with theater benches and props to prove their disdain for the Barnstormers before they inhabited their wharf theater. So, but that sort of takes us away from the very early years. That was probably into the 1930s. And there was also very early activity going on in other areas of Cape Cod. For example, on the Isle of Nantucket, there was an actors colony that formed in the town of Seaconset. And this was known as the Sconset Actors Colony. And it was actually made up of people who had long traditions. They were members of families that had long traditions in theater. And like the group in Provincetown, they were also looking for a place where they could see what their own pens could do. and their own performances could do. So they began by performing in various locales around Sconset, and then created a really expansive artist colony, which in fact included a tennis court and a bowling alley. And then eventually they created what was called the Sconset Casino, which offered them a lot of space, a lot of room for big productions and for bigger audiences. So they were able to create some really spectacular productions at that time. And it's important to know that they were actually the seed for a group that continues to this day in Provincetown, in Nantucket. The Theater Workshop of Nantucket actually continues to produce everything from light comedy to serious drama, and have a long and continuing history on the island. So again, there were other areas, and another was Falmouth. If you take a short hop back across Nantucket Sound to the town of Falmouth, then there was a group that formed in the early 20s called the University Players. And the University Players, as their name implies, was made up of students from Harvard and Princeton and Radcliffe, and then a number of other universities and colleges in the area. And that actually became home to a number of soon-to-be luminaries, including Henry Fonda and Margaret Sullivan and the noted Broadway and film producer Joshua Logan. And in fact, in his autobiography, Joshua Logan talks about his starving artist days in West Falmouth and what that meant to him as he continued in his career. And he said that not only were they totally dedicated to their art, but they were also completely dedicated to each other. And that kind of dedication actually enabled them to create some spectacular productions. They, in fact, created a production of And All That Jazz that for all the world looks like a Busby Berkeley production. So, and this was a group of university students that did this. Sadly, they unfortunately disbanded after a few years, but that certainly didn't mean that theater history was done either on Cape Cod or in Falmouth. In fact, there was an early jewel in the crown of theater on Cape Cod, and that was the Falmouth Playhouse. And this was a magnificent structure that sat on the banks of the Coonamessett Lake. And in fact, it included not only a huge theater that, believe it or not, back in the 20s and 30s had a form of air conditioning, but it also had a restaurant and nightclub that overlooked the lake, and an oval-shaped European-style bar. And this became home to a number of stage and screen stars at the time too, including Tallulah Bankhead and Helen Hayes and Gertrude Lawrence, who we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, but she actually became the wife of Richard Aldrich, who at a point in the 1930s took over the running of the Falmouth Playhouse along with a number of other theaters on Cape Cod. But it was a magnificent structure, and again was home to so many stars. And that actually became a trademark for Richard Aldrich in his star machine that he brought to all four of the theaters that he owned and managed at one time. But again, we're getting sort of ahead of ourselves here. So I want to get back to some really early theater history. So the Cape Playhouse, which is the oldest continually operating summer theater in America. And this is in Dennis on 6A, which is the old King's Highway in Cape Cod. And the Cape Playhouse was actually the brainchild of Raymond Moore, who was one of the Provincetown players. And this is sort of a theme in Cape Cod theater, that again and again the same names crop up because of the expansive and ever-growing theater culture. People sort of move from theater to theater, and it's continued to this day, really, that an actor might find a play that appeals to him in Provincetown, and then the next week be in a play at the Cape Cod Theater Company in Harwich. So this is sort of a theme of Cape Cod theater. So Moore was acting with the Provincetown Players and with the Barnstormers, and tried his hand at playwriting as well. But he decided that he wanted to start a theater in the commercial and business area of the Cape, so in the Mid-Cape area. So he began looking around in Yarmouth and Dennis, and then sort of really focused on Dennis, and actually found a building, the Nubscusset Meeting House, which was 200 years old, which he bought for the princely sum of $200. And then found a parcel of land, a 3-acre parcel off of 6A, off of the old King's Highway, and had the Nubscusset Meeting House moved there. And apparently this is something that happened more regularly around the turn of the centuries and into the teens and the 20s, that buildings were moved. So he found this parcel of land, and by 1927, he was ready to open the Cape Playhouse. And the first season, in fact, featured a performance by Basil Rathbone. And then the next season featured a performance by a newcomer, Henry Fonda, and another newcomer who actually got her start as an usher at the Cape Playhouse, and then got a little part in a play called Mr. Pym Stops By. Now that play will forever fall into obscurity, but the name of Betty Davis will stay with us forever. So that was a tradition that began bringing in stars to the Cape Playhouse, and but Moore had more on his mind than just a single theater. He wanted to create an art colony. And so he began using the buildings on the property. One was became a junior theater, and then one was a building for storing props and staging. And then another building became the Cape Cinema. Now, the Cape Cinema is still noted around the world for its classic feel and for its attention to classic films and to new avant-garde and foreign films. But it's also noted for a fabulous ceiling mural that was produced by artist Rockwell Kent. And so the cinema opened in 1930, and in fact was the site of the world debut of The Wizard of Oz. So unfortunately, by the 1930s, Moore was beginning to fail both physically and financially. And so he turned over his the management of the Cape Playhouse to Richard Aldrich, who was at that time the producing manager of the theater, and eventually became its owner, and then eventually owned 4 theaters, as we said, the Falmouth Playhouse and the Cape Music Circus, which became the Melody Tent, and then the South Shore Music Circus. And in all of those areas, he brought real star power. And again, as I said, that's continued in the Cape Playhouse, which continues to bring in luminaries every year. So, as I said, also Gertrude Lawrence was Mrs. A, how she was known lovingly around the Cape. And she was absolutely a force in the arts culture on the Cape and in the community around her. And in fact, there is a theater in the Dennis Union Church that bears her name, the Gertrude Lawrence Theater. So that's it. That's the dramatic early history of theater on Cape Cod, beginning in a sleepy little fishing village in Provincetown and creating an unbroken line of evolution that has transferred along the Cape and continues to this day. And as I said earlier, it has been kind of a hard time for theaters on the Cape. They were darkened, but they have continued to produce performances and presentations and classes virtually, and they'll be ready to take to the stage when it's time, because after all, the show must go on.
Thank you. Is Sue still with us?
You lost me for a minute, but I'm back.
What a well-researched book
you.
you've written, and I'm just so impressed, and it's so wonderful to hear those names and the history, and it just gives you a tender feeling for all the work that has been done on our shores, to bring theater to our community and to the nation, really, when you think of all the people who come here and enjoy the Cape. It's just so impressive, and it must have taken quite a bit of research. How long
It took
did
me
it
about
take
a
you
year
to write
the book, and it was probably 6 months in research that it took me. And I mean, luckily, I just had so much cooperation. I know I spent a long time talking to you and Sue Kossoff, and at every theater, people were just so lovely and accommodating. And the museums, people opened their archives to me and allowed me to just flip through old programs and old posters and photos. And so many theater families were helpful in doing the research. That's another thing, as well as people moving from theater to theater, there are generations of theater families. And people told me their memories of their parents when they were on stage and growing up basically in theaters. So many people who are still in theater were children in theater, like the young people at Harwich. So I heard all of those stories and have included them in my book.
I can't wait to read it. And we're so hoping to have a big reception and a book signing for you at the theater. And I hope we're still able to do that once we're able to gather
once the
again.
book is out, also the pandemic added to the publisher decided to hold it off until next May. So I think that made good sense.
Okay. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait for people to read it and to know all about it and to get back. And it is true. Theaters are struggling, and if people out there want to contribute to our beloved theater, we would certainly welcome it because we are approaching our 70th season. We're founded by Betty Bowe in 1951.
Right.
And she was a theater visionary, and so many people have come through our theater and all the theaters on the Cape, really. I don't want to omit anyone, but if you want to donate to our theater, text 70 years to 44321. You can do that on your phone, on your iPhone. 70 years to 44321. 2021 is our 70th season. Or go to capecodtheatercompany.org/giving. And we are approaching the season of our annual appeal, and hopefully we will all live to see another day. I think there's a lot of hope that's coming forth, and you certainly have added to that, Sue. Writing this book.
Well, and it
means a
really
lot to
does.
us.
I hope create a sense of hope, because I think to be able to see just the unbroken evolution of theater history in the Cape makes us realize that we'll be there. We'll continue to be there. The theaters will be there, and they'll be ready
Right.
to pick up the mantle again when it's time.
Right. And, I'm in my 25th year almost as artistic director at Cape Cod Theater Company, Harwich Junior Theater. Matt's in his 5th year as technical director. Tammy, I think, is in her 20th year as director of education. But the one thing I want to say is that, we have relationships, like really strong and fond and warm relationships with just about every theater on the Cape. From the Academy of Performing Arts to Chatham Drama Guild to Cape Rep to Cotuit Center for the Arts, Eventide, Cape Playhouse. We talk to each other, and there's a definite warmth and a feeling of enrichment between all the theaters. I think we help each other, and somebody once said to me that the more there is, the better. Because it only develops more audiences. And
Right.
Our goal is to develop theater-going audiences for the future, and to grow it. Because I once heard that if you don't go to a theater, a live presentation, by the time you're 12 and really enjoy it, chances are you might never really enjoy live theater or go to live theater as a habit. So that's what we want to develop, and we want to keep it going through this century and into the next.
And theater people are so warm and giving too. I mean, what you've done, what you've given of yourself, you and Matt and Tammy, and at every theater, I see the same thing. It's just incredible, the skills and talent that they pass on.
Yeah, well, it's a labor of love, because you can't count it by the hours, can you, Matt? Matt's the first to know that. I mean, honestly, nobody ever worked a 40-hour week in the theater. I don't, unless it was you were off for the season or something. So, well, it's just been so lovely to have you.
It has been so lovely to be here.
But before you go, tell me one of the quirkiest habits you have when it comes to writing.
I'm sorry, what?
One of your quirks, one of your writing quirks.
Oh, one of my quirks. Well, let's see. I need to have a mug of either coffee or tea in my hand at all times, which makes it hard to write. Right?
Do you write on the computer or Corona?
Or that.
Yeah, I have another question, and this is one I wanted to ask you. You've written 20 books as a ghostwriter, and
writer, right? Yeah,
that fascinates me. I mean, doesn't it sound mysterious, Matt?
Incredibly mysterious. It's what are you trying to hide?
It's a little frightening when you pick up a book and you know how many books are written by actually ghostwriters or are co-written by professional writers. And what happens is an executive or someone who is very busy in their life just doesn't have the time to write. They have the expertise and the name, the background, the notoriety. So they hire somebody like me or the people in my business, in my company, to write it for them. Happens all the time.
And your company is called
Your Writers.
Your Writers. It's fascinating. Can you tell us? I mean, can you divulge who you've written for, or is that a top secret?
Oh, well, I wrote 2 books with the Assistant Secretary of Labor, whose name is Al Angrisani. He was in the Reagan administration. So we wrote 2 books together. And then, I don't know, so many, we often write books, as I said, for executives, corporations. So largely they're corporate names.
Right. Wow. Well, we certainly have so many beautiful theaters on the Cape, from Provincetown to Wellfleet Harbor Actors Theater, Payamet. I mean, it's just phenomenal.
It really is. We're so lucky to be here and to have it. It's a wealth. It's an absolute wealth.
To have worked with many of them, and Matt as well. And, we just hope it all continues. So, and it will. There'll be a renaissance.
It will. There will be a renaissance. There will be a great renaissance. I know that, in all the arts. People are ready for that. They need it.
They really, well, live theater transforms lives, as you said. And there's nothing like being in a theater and feeling that energy. It's an active listening. It's an active, sitting in a live audience is active participation. It's giving your attention actively. Whereas, this is great that we have the screen, but, people can sort of like zone out and be passive about it. So
right.
Live theater compels your attention.
It does. It does. Right.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to be here with both of you.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll see you reviewing one of our shows.
Yes, very soon, I hope.
I should say that tomorrow night and Saturday night, we have Everyman, directed by James Byrne at the Arts Center. It's an outside audience. You have to bring your own chair. Matt is the house manager, parking lot director, and everybody has to be masked. You have to bring your lawn chair, and you have to reserve in advance. You can do that online at capecodtheatercompany.org. But it's truly fascinating what the actors have been able to do with social distance, masking, the lighting that Jim Byrne created, and the projections that Matt and Jim created onto the building. It's such an incredible show, and the lesson that you learn from it is, what we always leave behind is our good deeds. That's the only thing we can really leave of value are our deeds. And it's really a great show. So if you're up for it, please come this Friday or Saturday to Everyman. Next Thursday we have Michael Paul Brennan from Nashville, singer-songwriter. And beyond that, in December, we will have Murray Doherty and Richard Sullivan. Also, Celeste Howe and Malcolm Granger are going to do a concert for us. And hopefully we'll also have a holiday Christmas Hanukkah surprise. So anyway, once again, if you want to donate to our theater, please text 70 years to 44321 or go to our website, capecodtheatercompany.org/giving. Thank you so much for supporting our theater and all the beautiful theaters on Cape Cod. Thanks.
Thank you
so much. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Lots of love.